Friends, welcome back to Extraordinary Connections and a happy third day of Easter. Today is Tuesday, and the Tuesday following the Sunday that we began celebrating Easter. But Easter is far more than can be packed into just one day. It's rather like Christmas in that regard. You might know from the 12 days of Christmas that we traditionally celebrate Christmas for 12 days. Easter is similar, but we take it even longer and celebrate it for a 50-day season. 50 days to celebrate that the tomb is empty. 50 days to celebrate that Christ is risen. 50 days to celebrate that God is victorious even over death. And it's a good and it's a wonderful time of celebration, but I wonder if it feels a little bit weird this year. On Sunday, we sang the familiar Easter hymns, but we sang them in an unfamiliar world. We struggled to figure out how to adapt all of our family traditions into an unfamiliar world. And I wonder if, in that sense, Easter this year is an awful lot like the first Easter. There are lots of parallels to make, but I'm drawn particularly to one that I found in the very last verse of the very last chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 24, the last chapter, is where you find the entire resurrection story all packed into one chapter, and in fact all packed into one day. The way that Luke tells the story, the women go to the tomb in the very early morning. They find that it's empty. Some men show up and say, "What were you expecting? Jesus is risen." They go off and tell the disciples. Jesus wasn't in the tomb, Luke tells us, because he was on his way out to Emmaus. He meets two other disciples there. They haven't heard the good news, or at least they don't quite believe it just yet. And so he explains it all to them, and then he shows up in the breaking of bread and disappears from their sight. They head on back into Jerusalem, and Jesus follows them not too long after, because the 11 apostles are all huddled together, and Jesus shows up among them and says, "Look, here are my hands, here are my feet. Could I have a piece of fish to eat if it's not too much trouble?" And they celebrate that he's there. And then Luke tells us that Jesus gathers up his apostles and his followers, and he goes outside of town where he ascends into heaven. And then everybody heads right on back into Jerusalem. And Luke ends his whole gospel by telling us what all these followers of Jesus did. They went in Jerusalem, and then he says in verse 53, "And they were continuously in the temple praising God." Continuously in the temple praising God. For something wonderful just happened, and it was worth celebrating. It was worth spending days continuously worshiping. But in this strange new world of resurrection, they didn't have anything yet written for their situation. Charles Wesley, who wrote what I think is the best Easter song, wouldn't be born for years and years to come. Nobody had written yet things to use in their worship. And so I imagine in these days of worshipful celebration, the disciples went back to all of their worship repertoire from before the resurrection, from before Jesus. They went back to familiar texts and familiar tunes, and they sang them in an unfamiliar time. One of the things I do each week as a pastor is I figure out how to put together a worship service for Sunday morning. Which text will we be reading? Which liturgy will we use? Which hymns will we sing? Sometimes I find a hymn that has words that speak so perfectly to what I want us to hear and to be able to say that Sunday. But I look at the notes on the page and discover that it's set to a tune that I don't think I can sing, and I'm not sure anybody else wants to try. And so one thing that our hymnal does for us is it gives us a way to link up texts with tunes. Each hymn text is written with a certain meter, and so if you can match up the meter of the text with a meter of a different tune, you can put them together and sometimes create bizarre combinations. For example, you probably know the song Amazing Grace. We probably all sing it to the very same tune. But we don't have to. We could sing it like this. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but 'twas blind, but now I see. And it feels strange, a familiar text to an unfamiliar tune, familiar words in an unfamiliar place. And it challenges us, but in a way that makes me wonder if it might also gift us something new. If we experience familiar things in an unfamiliar time, might we learn something new about them? Will a new word be emphasized that has particular meaning to us? Will it unwrap a different insight that's particularly valuable for the situation that it's in? Now, just to prove that it's not a fluke, and to give you a chance to listen for that, we're going to sing Amazing Grace again, to a third tune, and another unfamiliar tune. And listen and see, do different things stand out? Is there something different you notice in the text when it's set to an unfamiliar tune? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. 'Twas blind, but now I see. This is the gift of music, the gift of familiar words in unfamiliar times. I saw on the news today, on Good Morning America, and I imagine it's in other places as well, that there is a nurse at the St. Joe's Hospital in Livonia who, a little bit on a whim, sang Amazing Grace a cappella at shift change to her fellow nurses. It was an impactful moment, meaningful for all who heard it. She's been invited on these news stories. They've been writing about her. They've been asking her to sing it again and again because familiar words mean something more in this unfamiliar time. Friends, one day, it might be during this next 50 days of Easter, or it might come after, we'll go back to a world that feels a lot more familiar. We'll gather together in sanctuaries. We'll sing familiar songs. We'll do all of those traditions that we've been missing. But I wonder, can we make that transition back without letting go of the things we have learned by celebrating familiar texts in unfamiliar times? When we go back to what is familiar, can we take the lessons that God has taught us with us? And I can't end by playing Amazing Grace for you twice with unfamiliar tunes. So here it is one last time, just the way you might imagine it in your head, but perhaps with a bit more insight now. That saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. 'Twas blind, but now I see. He is risen. Happy Easter. Go in peace.